Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we're doing our last playoff preview video before we do the actual one next month after the standings are finalized. We'll look at how the standings look like at this point in time as of March 18th. I'll go through each of the playoff matchups and give you who I have going to the Stanley Cup final as of right now. We'll go to all this coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Now before we begin this video, don't forget to like this video and subscribe below. Thank you for all your support, it would really help the channel. We're on the road to 500 subscribers, so if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button down below and hopefully we'll comment down in the comment section below. Really love to hear your guys' opinion on the updated playoff picture and what you think would happen, so I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comment section below. But in today's video, we have yet another playoff preview video here to discuss. We're going to take the playoff picture as it looks like as of March 18th, 1 month before the season finishes. I'm going to give you my playoff predictions as the standings sit right now and who I would have going to the Stanley Cup final. So let's just recap how the standings look right now. So in the Western Conference, the Winnipeg Jets will be the first team in the West. They would also win the Central Division with a 710 points percentage. I'm going off of the points percentage stats right now. Then you have the 664 points percentage Dallas Stars second in the Central, and the 625 points percentage Avalanche third in the Central. So really good stuff there. The Knights will win the Pacific Division yet again. They have a 642 points percentage. They'll be ahead of the Edmonton Oilers who have a 618 points percentage, and the LA Kings who have a 614 points percentage. Those two will be 2-3. The first wildcard team will be the 596 points percentage Minnesota Wild, and the second wildcard team will be the 551 points percentage Vancouver Canucks. Those will be the points percentage teams in the Western Conference. So in the West, you'd have a matchup of Winnipeg versus Vancouver, Vegas versus Minnesota, Edmonton versus LA, and Dallas versus Colorado. On the Eastern side of things, you have the President's Trophy winning Washington Capitals with a 721 points percentage, win the East, the League, and the Metro Division. And then you would be followed by a 642 points percentage Canes and the 580 points percentage New Jersey Devils. Those would be the top three teams in the Metro. Then you'd have the 625 points percentage Florida Panthers be the first team with 619 points percentage both Tampa and Toronto in the second, third spots. So at that point in time, they will be 2-3 in the Atlantic, but Tampa does have the tiebreaker, so they will be in the second spot. Then you'd have first wildcard Ottawa Senators with a 575 points percentage being in the first wildcard position, and 545 points percentage Montreal Canadiens being in the second wildcard position with a 545 points percentage. So all in all, those will be your standings in the Eastern Conference. You'd have a Canadiens Capitals matchup, a Senators Panthers matchup, a Leafs Bulls matchup, and a Canes Devils matchup in the first round. So those are the 8 playoff series we would see if the playoffs ended 1 month before the end of the actual regular season. So here is who I have going through. So in the first matchup we're going to look at here, we're going to start in the Eastern Conference. We're going to look at the President's Trophy winning Capitals taking on the second wildcard team Montreal Canadiens. That would be an interesting series. Now the Canadiens have proved a lot of people wrong. I thought they would be above 500 this year and be in contention for maybe a playoff spot, but not really make it. At this point in time, they are in a playoff spot, which is surprising to me. I did not expect the Canadiens to be there. Capitals, I couldn't make the playoffs. I did not expect them to be the President's Trophy winners, which they would be right now. So at this point in time, it will be an interesting series. Offensively, I do think the Capitals have the way deeper forward group. Defensively, I would give the edge to Washington. Way more experience and also way more complete defensive core at this point in time. And if you just stack up Thompson against Montembeault, I'm taking Thompson all day, especially after the season he's had this year. So I would worry about the Habs' young blue line as a potential problem for that team if they enter the playoffs. And I think Montembeault's just not a good enough goaltender at this point in time. I think they could go toe-to-toe with the Capitals given their youth and given the Capitals might be one of the older teams in the playoffs. Maybe not one of the oldest teams in the NHL, but one of the older teams in the playoffs for sure. So I would say that this would be a long, hard-fought series, but I'm taking the Caps in 7. I think the experience of the Capitals will prevail, and I think just making the playoffs is a big win for the Habs. So that's what I have in that series. The other Metro series would be the Canes and the Devils. Now, for the longest period of time, I was picking the Devils because I would think they would go to the Cup final, but with them losing Jack Hughes, losing Brian Dumoulin, not really doing much over the past little while, and having a little bit of a sour stretch, and with the Canes popping off over the past couple of weeks, I am going to take the Carolina Hurricanes in a simple 5-game series. I do think the Canes, right now, as it sits right now, especially with Jack Hughes out, do have the better forward group. Defensively, especially with Dougie Hamilton out, do have the better defensive core. I do think that although the Devils do have the better goalie in Markstrom than Anderson, I do think that the complete Carolina Hurricanes team would be able to get by a banged up New Jersey Devils team. So I do think it would be a short series. I do think, even after all my predictions about Jersey getting out of the first round, I do think they will be out in 5 games. So I would have the Canes going to the second round, making a Capitals-Canes second round matchup. So then you go over to the Atlantic Division, you have the Battle of the Kachucks, Florida versus Ottawa. This will be a really hard and entertaining series. For the forward groups for these two teams, they stack up pretty well against each other. I think especially after the additions Florida made in season, I do think that these two teams stack up pretty well. I would give the slight edge just given the depth to Ottawa, but I think those two forward groups stack up really well against each other. Defensively, Ekblad's going to miss the first 2 games of the playoffs. I think that could be really costly for the Panthers, but I do think both teams stack up pretty well defensively against each other. Maybe a slight edge to Florida once Ekblad gets back. And net, I would give the slight edge to Ottawa. I think Allmark right now is a bit of a better goaltender than Bobrovskis, but those are 2 superstar level goaltenders. So I think it'll be a long, hard-fought series as well, just like the other wildcard versus division winner in the Eastern Conference. But I'm picking Ottawa to have the upset. We've seen over the past couple of years, teams who win the Stanley Cup go on to have early exits the year after. And I just feel like Ottawa is a team built for the playoffs. And I think it'll be a long, hard-fought 7-game series. But I do think with the additions that the Senators made, and with the Panthers just coming off back-to-back Stanley Cup final appearances and winning the Cup last year, I do think it'll be the Senators who come away with the narrow upset. So I have them going through. Then you have the Leafs and Bolts. This was a matchup just 2 years ago. I think only one time in the last 20 or 21 years that the Maple Leafs has gotten out of the first round. And guess what? It was against those Tampa Bay Lightning. So I think offensively, they stack up pretty similar against each other. I do think that the Leafs do still have the depth, but the Bolts have gotten it a lot closer after the Bjorkstrand and Gord additions. Defensively, especially after the Carlo addition, I think that the Leafs had the way better blue line. And that, once again, he's still like a top 5 goaltender in the NHL. I'm going to give the edge to Tampa with Vasilevsky. But with the way Wolves been playing recently, I don't think it's by much. So I think these two teams stack up pretty well against each other. But I think just like it was 2 years ago, the Leafs will find a way to eke out a win against the Bolts. I do think that the Bolts could easily win that series. I think most of the series in this Eastern Conference setup right now would be very close series, but I do think the Leafs would get by the Bolts in 6 games. I do think they would be able to, even as the road team, wind up getting those wins. And I do think they'll be able to get it done before a Game 7 hits. So you'd have second round matchups of Caps Canes and Leafs Senators, Battle of Ontario. Going over to the Western Conference side now, so you have the Western Conference winning Winnipeg Jets taking on the Vancouver Canucks. Fall from grace from the Vancouver Canucks after they won the Pacific last year, but they would, in this scenario, sneak ever so slightly into the playoffs, beating out Calgary and St. Louis. So really good stuff there for the Canucks. Now, I think this Canucks team, they just beat the Winnipeg Jets earlier yesterday, so interesting to note there that they showed they can beat the Winnipeg Jets. Offensively, teams stack up pretty well against each other. I would give the edge to Winnipeg because I do think they have way more depth, but they would stack up pretty well against each other. Defensively, especially if Quinn Hughes is healthy, I would give the slight edge to Vancouver. I do think they have the more complete defense at this point in time. Goaltending wise, Hellebuyck's the best in the league right now. You gotta give the edge to the Jets in the net. So I do think these teams stack up pretty well against each other, but I do think with the Jets and how lethal they're playing right now, I would take the Jets in a 6-game series. I do think the Jets will be able to get done before Game 7 hits. I do think the Canucks will be able to get 1 or 2 wins given how well they are constructed right now, but I do think that Jets will wind up coming with the victory. Then you have what would be probably the marquee matchup of the first round between the Colorado Avalanche and the Dallas Stars. These two teams stacked up right before the trade deadline, and they both are looking like powerhouses. So the fact we have to see one of those teams out in the first round is an atrocity. So offensively, I would give the edge to Dallas. They have so much depth on that forward group and so much talent. They have like 3 second-line units. Like that team is a offensive machine on the forward group, and especially if Sagan got back into the lineup at some point during that series, that would be such an offensive improvement for the Stars. Defensively, I would give the edge to Colorado. I think they do have the more complete blue line, especially if Heiskanen is out for any length of time in that series. I would give the defensive edge all day to Colorado. In net, it'd be really close. I would say the slight edge to Jake Onger, but very slight. Mackenzie Blackwood's been really good this year, so I think this would be an interesting series. It would definitely be a long, hard-fought 7-game series between these two behemoths of teams. But I would say that the road Avalanche would wind up coming with the 7-game series. I just think that especially if Heiskanen is injured, that team has such a better blue line. That team still has a pretty good goaltender in Blackwood. That offense can click on all cylinders. And I do think the Avalanche would oust their former teammate in Mikko Rantanen and the Dallas Stars in a 7-game series. You go over to the Pacific Division, you have the Golden Knights now taking on the Minnesota Wild. For the longest time, it was looking like it was going to be the Avalanche, but now the Avalanche have surged. Minnesota's dropped a little bit. You have a Knights Wild first-round series. So offensively, I think the Knights really do have the better offense, especially if Kaprizov is still injured come playoff time. If Kaprizov's back, it's a lot closer, but I do still think the Knights have the edge. Defensively, far and away, Knights have a stunning, great defensive unit that they have, and I do think they have a better unit than the Wild do. In that, I think it'd be really close. I would give the slight edge to Vegas, given how Adin Hill's played this year, but only slight. Gustafsson's been pretty good too. So all in all, this would be a really intriguing series, but I would take the Vegas Golden Knights to win in 5 games. I do think that with the Wild's injuries, with all of their problems they've had this year, I don't think they'd be an overly huge opponent for the Vegas Golden Knights. I think the Knights will be able to relatively easily get by the Minnesota Wild, but I wouldn't be overly surprised if the Wild made that an interesting series, but I would take the Knights. And then for what is the 4th consecutive season in a row, you'd have the Edmonton Oilers take on the LA Kings in the first round. Another Oilers-Kings first-round matchup. Offensively, I do think that the Oilers have the better forward group, although I do think the Kings are slightly behind and only just lack the firepower that the Oilers have with guys like McDavid and Draisaitl playing. Defensively, I do think that the Oilers, after their improvements, do have the better defense. Once again, just slightly. The Kings have a very fantastic defense and play a really good team defensive style. And in net, I would give the edge to LA because I do think Kemper's a better goaltender than Skinner, but given how many times the Oilers have beat the Kings over the past 3 years, why go against the grain? I'm going to take the Edmonton Oilers in 6 games. The Oilers are a much better team, in my opinion, than the Kings, and while I do think the Kings will make it closer than it was last year, and I do think would not be overly surprised if they made this interesting, I do think the Oilers would wind up advancing. So in the Western Conference, you'd have Jets versus Avalanche and Knights versus Oilers. So we'll go back to the Western Conference here, look at the second round matchups. So you'd have the Jets versus the Avalanche, rematch of last year's first round matchup. Now, the last year, the Avalanche completely steamrolled the Jets. This year, these two teams stack up pretty well against each other. Offensively, I do give the Jets the edge because I do think they have more depth than the Avalanche do. Defensively, Avalanche, really sound team. I would say they have the edge defensively. And in net, Hellebuck, best goalie in the NHL. Jets have the edge in the net. So I think these two teams stack up pretty well against each other, but I do think the Jets are going to learn from their mistakes from last time, and I do think the Jets are going to end the Avalanche. I think it'll be a long, hard-fought 7-game series, but I would say the Western Conference champions are going to the Western Conference final. Then you have the Vegas Golden Knights taking on the Edmonton Oilers in a matchup 2 years ago's second-round series when Vegas wound up winning. These two teams stack up pretty well against each other offensively. Once again, Edmonton with McDavid, with Draisaitl, they have the better forward group. Defensively, Vegas, way by far the better defense. In that, once again, I think Hill is a better goaltender than Skinner. I think defense does win your championships. We've seen this before, and I do think that the Vegas Golden Knights have the better defense here, and I do think that's why they will wind up winning. I do think they have also enough firepower, especially with Riley Smith back, to get by the Edmonton Oilers, and they've shown that in the past. So I will say Vegas will wind up winning this series in 6 games, just like they did 2 years ago, to advance to another Western Conference final appearance for Vegas. Going over to the Eastern Conference side, we'll start with the Capitals and the Canes. These two teams stack up pretty well against each other offensively. I would say Carolina has the slight edge on the forward group. Defensively, Carolina has the edge. In net, Capitals with Thompson, way better goaltending than Anderson is right now, so I would say Caps have the edge in net. So these two teams, I think, stack up pretty well against each other, but I do think with the President's Trophy curse being still alive and well in the NHL, and on top of that, with the fact that the Carolina Hurricanes are clicking right now, I would say the Carolina Hurricanes upset the Capitals and win in 6 games and advance to the conference final yet again. So I do think the Canes will be able to take down the President's Trophy winning Capitals. And then we have the Battle of Ontario, Sens and Maple Leafs. Now, we've seen the Senators sweep the season series in the regular season. Now, in the playoffs, things are always different, but I do think these two teams stack up pretty well against each other. Offensively, I would give the slight edge to Ottawa with their depth, but both teams have fantastic offenses. Defensively, Leafs, the way they're playing right now, way better defense than the Senators. In net, I take the more experienced and superstar level Allmark over Woll, but like I said, Woll's doing really good this year, so I think these teams stack up pretty well against each other. I think it would be a long, hard-fought series, but I do think the Senators would once again be able to squeak out a win in 7 games. I do think it would be an interesting series, but I think the Sens team shown over the past couple of years that they are a better team than the Toronto Maple Leafs, and even if they don't show that in the regular season standings, they show that when they play against them. So I'm going to say Senators in 7. So that'll be conference final matchups of Jets and Knights, rematch of the 2018 Western Conference Final, and Senators versus Hurricanes. So those will be some interesting matchups. Now, if you go over to the Western side, we have the Knights and the Jets. Offensively, I do think the Jets have the better forward group. Defensively, Knights, much more complete blue line. In net, once again, Hellebuyck, best goalie in the NHL. I would say they have the advantage in net. So I do think these teams stack up pretty well against each other. It's a rematch of the 2018 Western Conference Final. But unlike the 2018 Western Conference Final, I will say that the Canadian team comes away on top. I'm taking Jets in 6 games. The Knights are a beast, a behemoth, and my favorite team. So I'm surprised in picking against them here, but the Jets, I think, are the more rounded and more complete team. They win the Western Conference, and now they win the Western Conference in the playoffs. I picked the Jets for, I think, like the 3rd straight playoff preview to go to the Stanley Cup final and have a chance to win their first ever Stanley Cup. If you go to the Eastern Conference side, you have the Senators and you have the Hurricanes. Offensively, I think the Senators, by a tiny bit, do have the better offense. Defensively, slight edge to the Hurricanes with the way that defense is constructed. In net, Allmark's a better goaltender than Anderson is right now. This will be an interesting series, but with all of the potentialities that the Hurricanes have had over the past couple of years, once again, I'm picking against them. The Hurricanes can always make it to the conference final, but they can never wind up finding ways to win in the conference final. I'm picking Senators in 5. I do think the Canes will wind up finally getting a conference final win, which is something I don't think they've done since they went to the Stanley Cup final, but I just don't think that they are a team who's suited to beat the team like they are with Senators right now. So you'd have a Stanley Cup final of Senators and Jets, which would guarantee the Stanley Cup comes back to Canada. I would love to see a Stanley Cup final like these two teams. Now, Senators are really wild card, and the Jets have proven themselves to be a team who ends up choking in the playoffs, so maybe this doesn't happen. But at this point in time, those are the two teams who I would think will wind up getting to the Cup final. And it'll be very reminiscent of 2 years ago Stanley Cup final between Vegas and Florida, where you have an Eastern Conference team who's a wild card team stun their way to the Cup final, and you have the Western Conference champions from the regular season win the Western Conference in the playoffs. And you'd have 2 teams who've never won the Stanley Cup before. So it'll be interesting to see there who would win between Senators and Jets. Offensively, I would say Jets do have the better forward group. Defensively, I would say Senators had the better defensive core, and you have a really solid goaltending matchup between Allmark and Hellebuyck. But once again, with Hellebuyck being the best in the NHL, I would say the Jets have the edge. So all in all, I think the Senators, just with the Panthers Stanley Cup run, came to an end in the Cup final 2 years ago. I'm going to say Senators Stanley Cup final run ends in the Stanley Cup final. I'm going to say Jets win in 6. I do think that Jets are such a powerhouse of a team right now that if they can find it working in the playoffs, they should be able to win the Stanley Cup this year, and they will bring the Stanley Cup back to Canada. So that's my Stanley Cup final. I have the Senators, I have the Jets, I have them playing for the winner who takes the cup back to Canada, and I have the Jets coming away on top, winning their first ever Stanley Cup and their first ever Stanley Cup final appearance. Definitely. That's my opinion on the playoff picture as it sits right now. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this playoff picture down in the comment section below with the way the standings shape up as it sits right now. Who would you have going to the Western Conference final? Who would you have going to the Eastern Conference final? And who would you have taking the Stanley Cup in the 2025 Stanley Cup playoffs? Definitely love to hear your guys' thoughts on all that down in the comment section below. That is all I'm going to talk about for today. Remember to like this video, and if you really liked it, remember to subscribe down below. It really does help with the channel, and we're on the road to 500 subscribers. I also do a blog talking about news, rumors, and analysis, stuff like that. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. I'll leave a link to that down in the description below. And I can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.